Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm doing the third episode of my series on the beliefs of ancient astrologers. So I hope you guys have been enjoying this series. Today, we're going to take a look in this episode at the spirit and matter distinction. Now, this is something that was common to a lot of schools of philosophy. Many mystics in both the East and the West were looking at this distinction between spirit and matter. And we're going to talk about this in relation to astrology today. Remember, the point of this series, very basically, whether you end up adopting these beliefs or not, is to just give you a sense of what the most likely faith statements or articles of faith were for ancient astrologers. Why did they do this? Where did they believe astrology came from? What did they believe its purpose was? What kind of reality did they believe that they were living in? What did they think about God, the soul, the universe, divinity in general? So for me, I approached this research several years ago from the standpoint of the evolution of my own faith journey with Bhakti Yoga. And I wanted to know specifically what, whether or not the beliefs of ancient astrologers were more and less in line with my own beliefs. And even though I practiced astrology for a long time, it was something I really hadn't looked into very deeply. I had a lot of assumptions. And so I just set out to figure this out. I mean, it's speculation on a certain level because I wasn't there. I don't know what ancient astrologers believed. I don't know how many different schools of thought there were, probably many. But one thing that I was confident in is that I could probably discover the most likely underlying shared beliefs and ideas that ancient astrologers had and that astrologers have had for several thousand years. So kind of almost like just getting down to brass tacks, what are the cornerstone beliefs of astrologers, and maybe broadly speaking, what did they believe astrology's purpose was? So again, whether you adopt these for yourself or not is up to you. I hope you find it useful, and it's been deeply interesting for me to come across all of this and to do this research. So in the first two episodes in episode 1, we looked at the idea of an ordered cosmos as foundational to the practice of astrology, the belief that the cosmos is meaningful, cohesive, ordered, just, true, and beautiful. And this is something that's common in both the Western Hellenistic world, which is very broad and contains many different ethnic and philosophical groups, and also in India, where there is basically the same form of horoscopic astrology taking place and being practiced, but different and being more informed by the Vedic tradition, the Upanishads, Vedanta Sutra, etc. So in the second episode of this series, we looked at the problem of the one and the many. We have the appearance of many diverse forms that are always fluctuating and changing, and also this idea of an underlying unity or essence that everything is a part of. And we talked about the importance of astrology in helping us to see the one in the many, because the tendency is, when we get identified with fluctuation and permanence and change, is to lose a stable sense of center and to lose track of that unified cosmos that we're a part of. So in part, astrology teaches us every day how to see ourselves as a part of a meaningful cosmos and how to see our diverse, fluctuating circumstances in terms of these unifying archetypal principles or symbols in the planets, and to understand that everything is held together by destiny or fate. So today we're going to look at the spirit and matter distinction, and this is just kind of something that's stemming from or evolving out of these previous two episodes so far. They're all pretty closely related concepts, but there's some differences too. So anyway, today, spirit versus matter. These are the philosophical schools in the first millennium BCE, especially around the middle of the first millennium BCE, that were well known in the Mediterranean sort of Hellenistic world, that were speaking of the distinction between spirit and matter, two different kinds of energies or two different kinds of realities that are related to one another, but also distinct from one another. So you have the Orphics, the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, and many other individual Greek philosophers around the mid-first millennium BCE, along with the Vedas and the Upanishads in India, who are the Vedas. Of course, the Upanishads are like philosophical commentaries or summaries of the Vedas. That's how some people would describe them. And they all move from the more abstract philosophical problem of the one and the many down to the implications of this problem for human beings. So all of these different schools start saying, what does it mean for us that there is a one and that there is a many? Why is this important to human life and human experience, psychologically or spiritually? Why do we even care that there's a many and that they're all unified and a part of this oneness? Why is that even important, right? In the Indian tradition of the Vedas, and especially the Upanishads, you could say from the 6th century BCE onward, it said that knowledge of one's true self, sometimes the word that's going to be, you've heard before is Atman, is said, is seen as a part of the cosmic self, the larger oneness, Brahman. So in order to understand that one's knowledge of that one's self, one's individual identity or spiritual essence is a part of this larger cosmic self. So the Atman is a part of the cosmic Brahman, is necessary in order to defeat the illusion of being only your body, or of being only identified with your fleeting material desires, or the coming and going of circumstances that are constantly pushing your mood and your emotions around and robbing you of happiness only to give it to you again, robbing you of happiness only to give it to you again. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which comes around the 400 CE on the other side in the Common Era, those sutras eventually flower from this same tradition of thought. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, right? This is one of the famous verses of the Yoga Sutras that says yoga means the cessation of the revolutions of the mind, or the ceasing of the turnings of the mind. So insofar as we are identified with the temporary changing nature, which sometimes is called materiality, that if we get identified with that, then we're identified with constant fluctuation and change, and there's no center there. There's nothing to stand on. It's like, in some ways, the equivalent today is like scrolling through a social media feed for too long. You just go like, oh my God, I can't handle one more opinion from anyone else about, and they're all diverse and fighting. And so this world was understood as in part as a reflection of variegation and change and impermanence and inconstancy and flux. And because one's body and one's mind participates in that, then we have a problem. We have a problem because the true self is thought to be eternal. The true self is thought to be spiritual, which is to say, it does not change. It does not display variegation and impermanence. There's something about it that is everlasting, that's unborn and undying. And this indwelling Atman is also a part of the all-pervasive, essential spiritual energy that's in all things, so that all things change but have coherence and are able to have something enduring behind them because of this larger Brahman. So in the ancient world, this is a problem that we see in both the East and the West being addressed. Like, look, if you go and just get lost in your head, and if you go get lost in the changing, ever-changing world of fluctuation and change, that's a very painful place to hang out. So the practice of yoga, like the practice of astrology and so many other spiritual techniques and disciplines in both the East and the West, have as their goal the desire to be identified with the true self, the unborn and undying self that doesn't change, so that while we move through the world of constant fluctuation, we do not get lost in it or torn apart by it, which as the Buddha says, even in the Buddhist tradition, that this impermanence is the seed of pain, desire and aversion. I want this, I hate that, give me this. Oh no, this happened. That kind of constant fluctuation is painful when we're identified with it. However, when we walk through, because we're human, so it's inevitable that we're going to walk through this realm of experience, this material realm, we're identified as a spirit soul walking through this different dimension of energy called material energy. Then we find happiness. Now, that's not that the Buddhist teaching is a little different than that, but this is essentially what ancient astrologers most likely would have adopted about the nature of the material energy versus the spiritual energy. The Orphics believed that release from my material identification is obtained through recollection of one's own godlike nature. Plato similarly compared the journey of the philosopher as one who moves from ignorance and identification with the realm of opinion and constantly fluctuating circumstantial energies to recollection or knowledge of the eternal archetypal forms. So for him, it's like a mental, a mental contemplative exercise. And he talks about astrology in his work, especially the Timaeus. What do the planets represent in both traditions? They're the wandering stars. They're the grahas or the grabbers. They are symbolic reflections of the constant fluctuations of events and circumstances in the material world. Why do we study them? So that we can remain seated remain seated on the throne of the soul, in the heart, and walk through them knowing these do not define me. These do not make me or break me. These are circumstances, all of which I can see God and eternity in if I train my mind, if I train my heart and my soul. Socrates, the Pythagoreans, the Orphics, and eventually Hermetic philosophers, they were all adamant in the West that for the soul, the eternal spiritual being within, to be free from its painful entanglement with the body in the realm of materiality, it had to aspire toward knowledge of eternality, that is spiritual knowledge. Astrology is therefore a spiritual form of knowledge seeking. It's a way of participating in the material world and sanctifying it, saying it's blessed, it's holy, it's sacred, because I have trained my eye to see the world of eternal forms within it. I have trained myself to see God in it. I have trained my soul to stay steady in its own nature within it. That doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just recognizing that it's like trying to, trying to hold on to something that's always slipping through your hands. So you have to train yourself to have a right relationship with that. Otherwise, you'll go mad in it. And that's exactly what we have in both the East and the West, the idea that over-identification with it leads to pain, illusion, suffering, and ignorance. I remember when I was a kid, I was with a good friend of mine, and we were in a mall somewhere. And back in the day when I don't know if people still hang out in malls or not. I'm so out of time. I haven't been to a mall for so long. But at any rate, we were in a mall, and I was like, let's go get a burger or something like that. And he was like, he was like, I'll keep my money and put it towards something that lasts, and you can put your money toward food that will give you like 15 minutes of pleasure. And I remember him saying that, and me, like, it was such a wise thing for my friend to say. And I was kind of like, suddenly, like, what am I suddenly in a Zendo? Or, like, are we gonna sit down and start meditating? And I think I gave some crap about it, but he was so right. And for whatever reason, just, so many years later, as I reflect back on that friendship, that's a friend of mine who ended up spending a year in India in an ashram. And he just had the making of a yogi in him from an early age. I think we were probably in the 7th grade or something like that. But that's the idea. The idea is that the material energy, you're going to have different takes on what it is, why it exists, but it's problematic if you get overly identified with the rise and fall of the stock market, your appetite, the comings and goings of fleeting things in this world, the coming and going of opinions and fads and trends. And if you get lost in that, it's a roller coaster ride that never ends, and it never really works out in your favor. And eventually it exhausts you. So ancient philosophers recognize this, ancient mystics recognize this, and they said, look, there's got to be an answer to this. Where does astrology fit in? Look at what the Hermeticists were saying about astrology. They were saying that these forms help us to see God in everything, these planetary forms. In a sense, the purpose of astrology was not likely, for many serious spiritual practitioners, was not likely something that was used every day to be navel gazing at one's own chart and being obsessed with what was going to happen the next day or the next day. To me, because they were not interested in making, in investing more in material outcomes that by nature should not be the source of our happiness. The source of happiness is within. It's who we are. It's something essential about our actual beingness. And that's not to say that there aren't circumstances in the world that you're not going to find painful, or that we can't inevitably walk through the world, or that we should somehow be dissociated from it. It's just being in right relationship to it. We have to be able to see everything in terms of this larger harmonia, this larger oneness, and also this sense of divinity, this indwelling sense of spirit, and this greater sense of God or divinity that the spirit is also seen in relation to on some level. Now, again, all these different schools are going to apply and address these subjects in various ways, but they're mixing and matching around the same problem. So the Stoics, they were popular from the time of Zeno, 3rd century BCE, well into the heyday of the Roman Empire, 2nd to 4th century CE, although they very likely, were adopting many beliefs from people like the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, the Orphics, the Hermetic philosophy that was emerging, that had a long previous existence in Egypt. So I say this because sometimes because some early astrologers appeared to have been Stoics, people will jump to the conclusion that early astrologers were Stoics. And I deeply believe that that's not true, but that doesn't mean that Stoics couldn't have easily adopted astrology, because it fits very nicely into many of their beliefs. One of the reasons I say this is also because the Stoics didn't really believe in a personal soul migrating from lifetime to lifetime. And that it would be hard to imagine, because of how prevalent that view is in India and in the West, that a school of philosophers who didn't believe in the transmigration of a personal soul from lifetime to lifetime created astrology. Anyway, the Stoics were popular from the time of Zeno, 3rd century BCE, well into the heyday of the Roman Empire. That's like 2nd through 4th century CE. They also suggested that there were two opposing substances, matter and reason, or like material and logos, both of which comprised God. So the two together somehow comprise the totality of divinity. The human soul was said to be part of the active substance of reason, or of God, this higher eternality. And it finds happiness, does the soul, by identifying with eternality and divinity, rather than the passive substance of matter, which is always fluctuating. So this is the exact same thing. And essentially you see the same teaching, regardless of whether or not there's belief in God or the soul. You see this very similar teachings in Buddhism, Taoism, and so forth. For the Stoics, this journey consisted of living in the moment, free of desires and fears, and acting ethically or virtuously, maybe, so, ethically or virtuously, while pursuing divine reason, or the higher. And remember, for them, divine reason that sounds really rational and logical and heady to us, but for them, reason was beautiful, and reason was just, and reason was true all at once. Human souls were similarly said to be emanations of the primordial active ingredient, the logos. This school of philosophy was one of the more popular schools during the Roman Empire, during the flourishing of Hellenistic astrology, but I personally think it's unlikely that astrology was a Stoic invention. I think much more likely that it has its precedent in Hermeticism, Egyptian mysticism, Pythagoreanism, the Orphics, the Platonists. I think it's probably closer to something like that. But, who knows? I could be wrong. Anyway, so all of these schools in general dealt with the idea that there is spirit and there is matter. And I think we're going to talk more about reincarnation and karma, and the likelihood of the belief in a soul that transmigrates from one lifetime to the next lifetime in the next episode. But for today, I just wanted to really emphasize that there was a belief that there is a distinction between spirit and matter. Now, you have different ways of dealing with why that would be there, and I don't want to go into that so much because the Buddhists are going to deal with that, slightly differently than theists would, and then there's a variety of different approaches in India within the Vedic Upanishadic tradition. There's like branches and tributaries coming off the main river of those texts that are going to say things like, ultimately there is no distinction between God and the soul. That enlightenment means merging, and that ultimately they're just one, and that this world is a complete and total illusion. The material energy is actually just illusion. you're going to have other schools that will say, no, the material world is real. It's just an impermanent, fluctuating energy. It's divine, and its interaction with the soul is a meaningful part of how spiritual life is cultivated, and that there is an eternal spirit soul, and there's also God, and they have relationship with one another that's divine and perfect, but they're not identical. The point is not to collapse your individual identity into God or something like that. So there's monism, and then there's just kind of qualified dualism isn't really the right word, but it's like a qualified way of understanding the relationship between oneness and duality. Anyway, so, and you see similar debates in Western philosophical traditions as well. Sometimes I think when, as a student, when I see all of this and I'm studying all of this, it's sometimes it's tempting to sort of throw up your hands and go, well, nothing matters, or it's all just historically, culturally conditioned stuff that people made up, or blah, blah, blah. I don't personally take that approach myself. For me, I've had to study and carefully reflect upon the different philosophical traditions and find the one that fits for me, and then lock in and practice in a tradition that works for me, while also knowing that, I don't want to exist in some kind of antagonistic relationship with different religious or spiritual or philosophical schools that may have come to different conclusions or chosen a different path. I don't think that means that everything is relative and anything is true. It's just sort of like saying that I think we can choose a faith path, and we can refine our beliefs as people without having to make other people wrong. I know that our logical brain wants to say, well, if I'm right and this other thing's right, that proposes very different or contradictory things to what I believe, then they must be wrong. It's like, no, they don't come to the same conclusions. And I'm going to stay in a humble place of being like, this is where I feel called. This is what I'm going to practice. These are where my beliefs take me. And God bless you. God bless other people who are taking different paths. I cannot believe in an all-loving divinity who would not be very graceful for us all doing the best we can with the information we have. So, but I always tell people when doing a series like this, it's one thing to be academically objective for the sake of trying to understand things. It's another thing to use academic objectivity or relativism as a kind of crutch to avoid having to take deeper risks and make deeper commitments with our spiritual life. And I don't think that means everyone needs to, join up some people just aren't going to be called to joining something, right? But refining and clarifying your own beliefs offers psychic ground to your practice. And even if those beliefs are very broad and general, at this series, I'm just laying out the most basic things that I think ancient astrologers probably believed. And then obviously there's lots of variety within them. But even that, to me is helpful. It's like I always use this analogy, and it's not mine, but you're digging a well and you just are digging lots of little, spade scoops out in the yard. You're not going to get to a well. You have to dig deep in one direction. I think that people sometimes think that if you dig in one direction, that makes you intolerant, because somehow it closes you down to variety or possibility or something like that. And to me, ironically, that's a very narrow way of thinking. I don't think that way. I think you can dig very deep in one direction, clarify your beliefs, understand the psychic ground you stand on, and still be open to the fact that other people will have done that same thing differently. So anyway, I want to explain that because I get questions about this kind of stuff. People, all of you guys who listen to this channel, I think you're so smart, and I really enjoy the questions that you have and the interactions, and so I'm very glad to be making this series, and I hope that it's interesting for all of you. All right. So in our next episode, we are going to talk about reincarnation and karma and what role that might have played in the beliefs in shaping the beliefs and practices of ancient astrologers. So in the meantime, remember when you're practicing astrology that what it's doing is helping you to see a unified cosmos. It's helping you to see the one in the many, and it's also helping you to retain a sense of yourself as an eternal spiritual being within the constant fluctuations of your life. So that's where we've gone so far, and I look forward to more soon. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.